Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Robert Boynton. Beyond a long career in journalism, Robert Boynton is now also the professor of journalism at New York University, where he directs a literary reportage project. But for today's project, we're going to be speaking about a recent book of his, The Invitation-Only Zone, the true story of North Korea's abduction project. Now, Robert came to this by his own account through a news story in 2002, and he turned on the television and saw this amazing spectacle of Japanese abductees returning from North Korea, stepping off the plane into a media scrum. On one side of their chest, they wore the badge of the advocacy group that had fought so hard to get them released. On the other side, they had the stock standard symbol of North Korea, badge of Kim Il-sung. What had happened to these people was stranger than life. In the late 1970s, they were stolen off beaches and quiet back roads in sleepy towns up and down the Japanese coastline. Increasingly, people were going out on late night walks, on dates, and not coming home. People finding their abandoned clothes, bags, sometimes cars still idling with the keys in the ignition. It was impossible to find out what had happened, and it was impossible to draw any real links between the different disappearances. They were just too far spread out across too many different coastlines, too many different islands. And of course, people go missing all the time for a range of reasons, like bad relationships, or just young, discontented people running away from home. Though as some people slowly suspected that the North Koreans had something to do with this, it was hushed away. It was a conspiracy theory, which of course only deepened the isolation of those who actually had been kidnapped. Elite groups of commandos had come to the Japanese coast, seized these people, pulled them back to Pyongyang, and used them for the furtherment of the North Korean state. Exactly what they had in mind, we will get into in this podcast, but it's a complicated story, so it's very hard to find out. Eventually, the evidence begins to mount up, and the Japanese soon enough realize that they have suffered a significant amount of abductions, and that these people are still living inside North Korea. So summits are called, talks are had, and that image in 2002 is the result of all of that. At least some of these people being released. And as both sides imagined at the time that this might be an end to the issue, a step towards normalization, this produced the absolute opposite. Japanese society was being torn in half. Old schisms about sovereignty and pacifism, about colonialism, about old war crime, and just what place a new Japan should hold in the world were suddenly being forced to the fore. To ram home the point, a poll at the time of Japanese citizens showed that 80% of them believed that the two countries were on the brink of war. That's how serious it was. But at the same time, the Japanese realized that America were not going to invoke their joint security pact. And Japan, if they wanted to act, they were bound by a pacifist constitution. They couldn't do it by themselves. This becomes a nation drawn inwards with emotional politics. An identity crisis is forced upon it in a way that it didn't expect. A nation suddenly having to relive its past and approach a future in a world that suddenly seemed dangerous, suddenly seemed risky, and for which they didn't have easy answers on hand. Now, I recommend books a lot on this podcast, but this one, The Invitation-Only Zone, is an absolutely fascinating read. I can't recommend it enough. The plight and the psychological anguish of the isolation of these people inside North Korea really rams home to the reader. It's an incredibly traumatic, gripping read. Now, as always, if you enjoy the podcast and you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached to this podcast, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. This podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. There will also be links below to Robert Boynton's website where you can find his work and, of course, links to the book itself. And so, without any further delay here, this is Robert Boynton. Robert Boynton, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So today we're going to be talking through your book, The Invitation-Only Zone, the true story of North Korea's abduction project. And I think we should begin this podcast the same way your book begins, with this sort of terrifying horror movie type scene on Japanese beaches in the late 1970s and early 80s, where people are going out for walks and they disappear and they're not coming home. And it has this horrible feel like a serial killer's on the loose. So take us there.
Well, as you say, in the late 70s and 80s, people started disappearing, both from Japan's beaches, even occasionally from its cities and towns. And, only in retrospect did people realize these were all connected. But you had this kind of almost alien abduction sort of scenario where people would simply disappear. No trace of them having drowned, or a struggle of some sort, or a body being found. And that's actually quite unusual, that usually there's some evidence. And I think one thing I wanted to get at was the very special quality of pain that the abductions wrought by leaving nothing behind, by leaving no clues of any sort, that, the relatives of those who were abducted had more to deal with than just their grief, but a giant question mark that was left by the absence.
And as you walk through this, there's always going to be a question during this, because, of course, we're moving towards this question of North Korean abductions. So what we have to ask now, I suppose, is, were the Japanese police simply incompetent here, or was it just nothing for them to go on? How is it looked back on now, the role the Japanese police had? Because, of course, many of these abductions were across a whole range of beaches, across hundreds of miles of coastline. Was there any chance of them piecing this together?
I think it would be unfair to say they were incompetent. I think if you look at the historical context, first, the abductions really were separated by time and space. There was one summer and one the next summer and one the fall. So, it's not as if a half dozen or a dozen people disappeared from one discrete place in 2 or 3 months' time. Secondly, I think there were a number of people in the Japanese police and even some journalists, local journalists, who suspected that not all, but a few of these abductions were linked. But you have to think about post-war Japan and in the 70s, that there was such a tremendous taboo against blaming the erstwhile colonies, in particular the Koreas, for anything, that I think that it was not easy to stand up and say, even if you thought you had some evidence for this kind of thing, to say that that North Koreans or any other erstwhile colonial power, colonial subject, was responsible. I mean, there was tremendous social sort of caution against this sort of thing. So the one journalist who did make a public announcement about this in an article, even he referred to the would-be abductors as a third country.
And how brazen were these abductions? Of course, some of them, I suppose, were on random, quiet, secluded beaches. But there was one of the young 13-year-old girl, Megumi, and she was abducted not far from the front of her house.
Yes, the abductions ran, as I'm sure we'll talk about. The phenomenon of abduction is not one thing. There are many different iterations of it. The one you referred to, Megumi Yokota, who was abducted from not far from her parents' front door in Niigata in northern Japan, that one was particularly unfortunate in that it's not clear that she was actually a target, in the sense that they weren't looking for someone like that. They pretty clearly didn't know that she was 13 years old. And the conventional thought is that she had perhaps witnessed them in some way and had the unfortunate sort of timing that she saw a bunch of them in a van of some sort and was thrown into it so as not to leave any witnesses behind. But yes, they were incredibly brazen. There was nothing. At their worst, they would go up to you on a beach, ask you for a light, hit you in the head, bind you up in duct tape, put you in a bag, give you antibiotics and a sort of sleeping pill of some sort, and throw you into a dinghy. I mean, it was sort of, grade B spy movie stuff. The kind of brutality of it was quite extraordinary, and the efficiency of it was amazing too.
And that dinghy would then take these captees out to a larger fishing boat, I suppose, was a fishing boat in disguise. And I guess within 24 hours, they were in Pyongyang and into these strange new lives.
Yeah, the dinghy would take them to a waiting boat, which was, as you say, a sort of a fishing boat that they're disguised to be a fishing boat, which would then take them to a larger boat, perhaps, and they'd end up in North Korea within 24 hours. It was all incredibly well planned, with the one sort of detail that was sort of up in the air of exactly who they would be getting, which is kind of amazing. So you have, incredibly well-trained spies, commandos, You've got this whole sort of setup with the various transport boats waiting for everybody. But the one detail that was left up to chance was who might just stroll along at that point. Now, there were some abductees in other phases of the program which were more targeted, but there was this random element to the many of the abductions that we know about that is I've never been quite sure how to think about that, whether that was a sort of incredible faith in the cosmic nature of reality or whether it was just flipping a coin.
So these would sound to listeners like the sort of one-off random type program, but it comes through from your book, and of course I guess this plays out quite strongly, that this was a made-for-purpose elite commando unit that was simply organized, structured, and trained just for abductions.
As far as I know, yes, I think they were, because I think the not only the training, but also, the North Koreans are very good at sort of siloing their information. So they're not going to take people who have done one thing and move them around so that they have, have a kind of, interaction with people in all sorts of other departments so that they will be able to share that information. So I think it was probably a solitary group of people who were committing most of these kinds of abductions.
And from there, let's take us inside these lives that they lived in Pyongyang. There's a lot. We're going to get into a lot more deeper questions here about why they were taken and the impact on these sort of countries. But what were the lives like inside North Korea? Of course, this takes us towards the title of your book. Let's take us inside the invitation-only zone.
Well, the process was quite carefully choreographed. So the intention was to abduct couples. Then they would arrive in Pyongyang eventually, and each of the member of the couple would be told the other one had been left behind, so as to create a kind of sense of helplessness. And that individual, man or woman, would be trained for about 18 months to 2 years in Korean language, in North Korean Juche philosophy, in the North Korean version of history, and sort of given the basics that one would need to function in North Korean society. And then a year and a half later, they would be brought back together with the person they've been abducted with. They would say, oh, actually, he or she was taken, and would you like to meet him or see him? And most of the couples I've talked to got married very quickly after that, again, all set up by this North Korean state. And the lives they led initially and throughout most of their time were in these gated communities, which are known as invitation-only zones. They're sort of the places that North Korean government keeps people who have access to unofficial outside information, thereby also sealing in that information. And these people could be diplomats, they could be spies, they could be translators, they could be interpreters, anyone who has access to these outside information sources. And the abductees were one of them. So the popular misperception is that the abductees were kept in sort of the equivalent of a gulag or something like that. That's not the case. These invitation-only zones were actually quite well taken care of. Their food supply was, even during the famine, was much better than the other people in the country. They had minders who would take them around and would chauffeur them around if they wanted to go into Pyongyang to shop. These invitation-only zones are sort of dot Pyongyang to its north and to its south. I've actually sat down with one of the abductees on Google Earth and showed me some of them, and they just look like ordinary communities. So, the thing about the invitation-only zones is that the North Koreans become very acutely aware of language, as I think any totalitarian or authoritarian regime makes you. And you have this situation where yes, these are gated communities, and yes, there are guards there, but really the sign at the outside says you can only enter if you were invited in. And an ordinary North Korean is sensitive enough to language to realize that that is a clear sign that she should stay as far away as possible. But it's a very clever way. You don't need to stop or no one enters and, that kind of forbidden secret zone. You just say you just need an invitation. And they know that's stay away from there.
Yeah, there's no half measures in North Korean language, I suppose. There's something that you mentioned there at the start, and I think we should touch on that again here, that when they were first brought into these invitation-only zones, they tried to make them feel as helpless as possible. And this was part of the psychological training of the spies. So they had a process in mind here. What were they trying to do? This sort of sense of destroying them psychologically so they could rebuild them.
Yes, they wanted to make them feel as helpless as possible, as you say. I think they had observed the fact that when two people are together, they conspire, they get closer, they fight back, they resist in some way, and they wanted to avoid that. But they also had observed, I think, the fact that if you keep an individual isolated for too long, he or she falls into despair and can even go insane or something like that. So, excuse me. So they had to calibrate those things. They understood, and again, the North Koreans are their psychology. They're very acute at these things. They understood the power of a bond between two people in circumstances they have not chosen, and in fact, they used that after the training and isolation of these abductees, as much as they use that bond with athletes, artists, and even diplomats. Famously, the North Koreans are very reluctant to let a diplomat or any other kind of person traveling outside of the country be accompanied by his spouse or any of his family. And this is a very specific tactic, which is that someone can be much more efficiently manipulated if his or her family is or more or less under guard. So they did understand that was an important thing, and they did hope to use the fact that they had a pair who would eventually have a real bond later on, but they didn't want that bond to kick in too early because that could lead to resistance.
And you mentioned there that when they arrived, the abductees themselves weren't the only people at least the Japanese abductees weren't the only people in these zones. And of course, there's a couple of famous American defectors, and some of these Japanese abductees were living in the same quarters. One of them actually married one of these Americans, so the famous two, I suppose, Dresnok and Charles Jenkins, and one of the Japanese captives married Charles Jenkins.
Yes, I don't think the Americans were living in the invitation-only zones, though they had their own quarters, and that was actually closer to Pyongyang. Partly because they were sort of this anomaly. I mean, there were at one point there were 4 American defectors who they threw together, and that's its own story. But they too were sort of trophies in a way, kept for later use in some way, though obviously they were not abducted. But the Japanese, the woman who was married to Charles Jenkins, and then some of the other abductees, a Romanian woman, a Lebanese woman, who were married to the other Americans, they were sort of introduced to the Americans kind of piecemeal, almost presented to them, you should get to know this person in some sort of way. I mean, not so subtly. And I'm not sure that those are necessarily happy marriages.
So let's dig into that psychological side of things a little bit deeper here. So you mentioned in your book, and it really hits the reader, this does, that children, no matter where they are, they perceive their lives to be normal. And of course, these abductees, they eventually fall into a routine of sorts. It's not pleasant, but it's a routine. But they have children, and these children grow up around them, and they spout the same anti-Japanese rhetoric, and they talk about the glory of the great leader and the dear leader. And it must have been a terrifying psychological experience to see their own children effectively on the sides of their jailers.
I think it was. The abductees, the Japanese abductees, were told to come up with some sort of cover story. They were going to be, they'd be living in these invitation-only zones, But even the other people in the invitation-only zones weren't supposed to know about this Japanese abduction program or the abduction program at all. So they had to come up with some sort of cover. And the cover they chose was that they would be Zainichi, which is to say ethnic Koreans who had grown up in Japan for part of their lives and then traveled to North Korea en masse in the late 50s and 60s, about 100,000 of them. And this was a well-known phenomenon within North Korea, that this large group of ethnic Koreans had left Japan and gone to North Korea. So that was a way that the Japanese abductees could account for the fact that they spoke Korean with an accent, that they had familiarity with things Japanese. They had not, didn't have the deep roots in North Korea that all other North Koreans have. And they had to hold that story up and, in fact, teach their children that that was the case. I mean, the best kinds of lies are ones that have an element of truth to them. And so the children grew up thinking they were, second generation Zainichi, but, born and bred in North Korea. And there was this kind of cognitive dissonance, I think. I know one of the abductees, Fukie Shimura, told me about a time when their kid was really pretty young, and they were saying, sort of putting things together. Let's see, I'm related to him, she's related to her. And one of the sons, they had three kids, two boys and a girl, and one of the sons said, wait a second, I hear you and Dad speaking Japanese, so you're Japanese. And then she said, well, if I'm Japanese, you're Japanese too. And the kid kind of recoiled in horror from this. So, this was a cover story that had one foot in reality and the other foot in this bizarre alternative reality that was constantly threatening to collapse.
So I suppose on that point we should touch on I have a lot to come on the Japanese question, but just at that point, let's touch on the Korean, especially the North Korean, deep hatred towards the Japanese. So some of these Japanese were taken into invitation-only zones. Some of them had access to libraries, even though they were restricted, and they began watching movies and reading books, and it was all about the nasty imperialist. Of course, it wasn't pleasant, of course, but these overdone propaganda movies and books about these horrible Japanese people.
Yes. Well, one of the reasons I was so drawn to this topic is I felt that the abductions and the abductees were a lens through which to look at Korean-Japanese relations in general, and that incredibly rich, vexed history, which lives enormously large in North Korea. I mean, North Korea, the kind of national identity was really forged during Japanese colonial period. I mean, it's not controversial, I think, to say that Korean identity was in many ways, and certainly Korean nationalism, emerged from the Japanese colonial period, and nowhere more so than in North Korea, where the two events loom incredibly large in everyday life, which is the Japanese colonial period and the Korean War. It's not an exaggeration to say that these are invoked on a daily basis, and so they, to learn about North Korea is to learn about the horrors of the Japanese. And, the Japanese did a lot of awful things. And these are things that are not taught well in Japanese education system. And Hasuike Karu, one of my main characters, one of the Japanese abductees, he had a very good education. He went to good schools. He was an excellent student, and then was at Chuo University, private school in Tokyo. But, especially in the 70s and 80s, I think Japanese education system was quite spotty when it came to things Korean, things Chinese. In fact, the only time, and I verified this at the time anyway, the only time that a student would encounter what had happened in Korea and southern China under the Japanese would be in courses on international or foreign history. It didn't appear in Japanese history. That was cordoned off. I don't know exactly what happened, but certainly they'd deal with the Meiji era and then probably skip over to the post-war era or something like that. So there was a kind of re-education where he had to, where all the abductees had to learn how Japan and the Japanese were perceived by the North Koreans, or else I think it's fair to say they couldn't really understand what it was to be North Korean.
And just to finish off on the life inside the zones themselves before we get to some of these deeper questions, these abductees lived through a fairly remarkable period in North Korean history. So they lived through the first transition of power, of course, the most risky one from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il, and they lived through the famine years where the regime was in real peril in a way it never had been before and maybe never has been since. And they lived through the famine in relative affluence compared to most people around them.
Yes, they did. I mean, this was, again, part of the attraction of the project. You had a group of people who lived through these pivotal moments in North Korean history from the inside, with some information from the outside because they had a sort of privileged place, but had to really perceive it and figure out what was going on. So, I was very interested in 1980. Is really the first among the first public mentions of Kim Jong-il's name, and I was very curious how do they perceive this, and Hasuike Karu was very upfront. He said, "Look, we've been there for 2 or 3 years, and clearly the country was not doing well, but here was a young man with promise and energy, and he was very enthusiastic. He thought my life might get better, the life for my children who had not quite been born yet, but will get better." The more puzzling he found the collapse of communism, 1989, 1990, 91, and how to perceive that and what to make of that with his limited knowledge. And it was sort of telling because actually the North Korean regime itself had a lot of trouble digesting and assimilating that kind of information. How to portray the collapse of the communist system to its people in a way that did not indicate that North Korea itself and its system was also imperiled. And then finally, the terrible famine of the mid to late 90s was something that was all too evident, even within this privileged zone. And even there, the supplies were much smaller and of lower quality. He could tell that the rice and other things were lesser quality. But it was actually one of the few places, I think, where the public distribution system, the system through which North Korea for decades had distributed food and other essentials, which collapsed completely during the famine, never to really revive. But it actually seemed to continue in these zones where such people who were privy to such information, and but he was aware of it sort of more by proxy because they had all sorts of servants and drivers and other people who kind of worked around keeping the zone up to up running, and he got close to a number of those people, and they would talk about relatives of theirs who were starving, and one had a new baby whose mother wasn't able to produce milk because she was so undernourished, and Hasuike Karu and his wife sort of took some of their own supplies and gave it to them and helped them live. So they were very much aware of the terrible straits that the country was in, even if there weren't people dying in the streets in front of them.
So I suppose it's important now to ask a question. Of course, this is a question that you say a few times in the book. It's hard to get a completely satisfactory answer for, but I'll ask you to be as plausible as possible here. What was the purpose of these abductions?
Well, to understand the purpose of the abductions, there are a few things you have to understand. First, one is that there were many different phases and kinds of abductions. People were, as we've discussed before, were abducted sort of randomly. Then there were others who were abducted with some more specific instructions. A certain kind of person was sought after. And then also the other thing one has to understand is that the abductions took place at a time of real success and kind of optimism for the North Korean state. I mean, up until, and this is so often misunderstood because we're so present-minded, we look at the situation as if it had always been that. But up until certainly the early to mid-'70s, North Korea was far more successful, far more modern and forward-looking, both technologically, economically, even politically, one could argue, than the South, which of course is completely at odds with what we perceive it today. But that was very much the way that North Koreans perceived themselves. We are on the winning team, as it were. In the South, there's this military dictatorship propped up by the Americans, which could never survive on its own. It will probably collapse soon. Here we have, very high GDP. We've got all the industrial production. We have access to minerals and things like that. We have food problems, but we're able to solve those because we have these treaties with China and Russia and other communist countries which supplement our food supplies. So the North Koreans were very optimistic and forward-looking. And, that kind of optimism isn't the sort of thing that runs out the second one's GDP ticks down during 1 year. It takes a while. And I think that it's fair to say that the North Koreans believed in their hearts that if you took someone from the outside, particularly a South Korean or even a Japanese, showed them the splendors and the amazing achievements of Kim Il-sung's revolution, that the natural reaction would be to sign up and say, yes, me too. I want to be part of this. This is the future. And again, there were, in 1975, there were Juche study groups in every prefecture in Japan. There were Juche study centers throughout Central America and Africa. The North Koreans were on a very aggressive sort of mode of kind of world domination, ideological domination, and they believed their own stuff. So which is all to say that I think the core of the abduction program was to abduct people from various parts of the world, in particular Japan, bring them to North Korea, prepare them to understand the splendors of the North Korean Revolution, and hope that, and even assume that, they would, once they saw it, turn around and say, yes, sign up, I'm signing up. You want me to spy, go back to my country and spy? I'll do it. So I think that actually the most unlikely, sort of unfathomable goal was the true goal. They did want to use them as spies who would be going both to Japan and Europe and other places and sowing the seeds of revolution, which they were sure would come eventually.
There are some challenges to that you bring up in the book itself. This sort of question of, if you wanted a Japanese spy, why not just take someone who was brought across during the colonial period, who was already there, that speaks good Japanese, or many Koreans spoke pretty good Japanese, or why not pick up any of these mass exodus of Koreans that returned, of Japanese Koreans that returned to Korea just before I suppose it was 1970 itself.
Yes.
So there's a strange sort of question of why go through all the hassle and all the pain and all the risk of snatching people off beaches, causing such a diplomatic incident, when there may have been easier ways to do this.
Yes, and that was, for me, a real stumbling block for years, just trying to get my mind around that. There were seemed to be so many workarounds, so many easier ways, as you're saying, to accomplish these goals. And I guess I came to sort of two conclusions. One was interviewing a defector in Seoul who was telling me, who had been, I think, fairly high in the regime, and was telling me that you can't believe how the lengths that the North Korean government will go to achieve what seem to us, the outsiders, tiny goals. And one of the I think about the way that the North sort of agitates about the speakers at the DMZ, or balloons going over. These are seen as real threats, and they expend a lot of diplomatic energy. Similarly, when a small bank account in Macau was frozen by the American government, it was, I think, $24 million, relatively small amount for a government. But it was $24 million that was used to buy presents for the elites or something like that. And the North Koreans, it was as if there had been sort of an all-out invasion. I mean, there was this huge diplomatic row about that. So I think that we think about the calculus that one makes in deciding to do something in our own way, and we have to sort of shift into their mindset. And the other thing is that I think that in the way that big, powerful governments do things that sometimes seem overblown, but you think, oh, well, that's what a big, powerful government does. I think that's very much the way the North Koreans were perceiving themselves. This is what powerful countries headed towards world dominance do. So I think they were more forgiving in that way. And the last thing that I maybe understand, I think, better the calculus going on was conversations I had with Kim Jong-il's chef, the famous Fujimoto, who spent, an extraordinary amount of time with Kim Jong-il, and he was just explaining how Kim, who was behind the abductions and behind this sort of desire to modernize his intelligence services, which I think was the key part of the abductions that really kept it going. He really believed in getting the best of everything. That you got, fish from Denmark or Norway, and you got, sushi from Japan, and you got refrigerators from the United States, and, that he knew where the best of everything was and deserved the best of everything. And if he was going to have Japanese-speaking spies, God damn it, they were going to be real Japanese people who were born and bred in Japan and not some ersatz sort of second best. And I think that was very important to them.
And what do you make of Charles Jenkins' idea that he believed that these people were being kidnapped, not so much that they would be the next generation of spies, but that they would breed the next generation of spies, that their children and the children after would become spies and they could pass through the world? And he was quite fearful of his own two daughters being put through this. And my next question coming up is going to be the 1987 bombing of the Korea airliner. So it does have a small touch to reality, that story, even if it is a bit far-fetched.
Absolutely. I mean, it was, again, the kind of thing it took. I mean, so much of writing this book was an intellectual exercise in that I had to, as someone from the West with such a thoroughly Western education, I have to really get my mind around some of these concepts, which are very basic, I think, for people growing up in East Asia, things like face and other things like that. But, also within an authoritarian regime, the idea that the government wants its citizens to seem as if it has planned everything down to the last second, right? That's very important, that it's all-knowing and all-seeing. You don't have to read George Orwell to get that impression. And so it makes sense for someone like Jenkins and others to believe that actually they knew, the regime understood the goals of this abduction process from the very beginning and had a very specific goals like breeding spies. And I thought this was, nonsense when he first told me. I interviewed him several times. But the fear that he had about his children was very real, that they would go into this international school, which had been training spies, in fact, and be put into this kind of a program, and then he'd probably never see them again. So I think that was very genuine. And the sort of icing on the cake for me was when I met another North Korean defector who had also been in the regime, who was actually a poet, and told me about something it was called something like the Seed Collection Program. And that was, in fact, a program where beautiful North Korean women would be sort of paired up with or assigned to visiting diplomats or journalists or businessmen, say, would have an affair with these visiting diplomats, businessmen, or journalists. And then the next time they were in the country, they would tell them, oh, I'm pregnant, it's your baby, and you now have to, take some role in providing for him. And again, it was this way to manipulate. You can imagine a journalist or a businessman or a diplomat who First, they know that they're open to blackmail, and also they have some genuine concern. My God, I have a child in North Korea with this. It's going to affect and alter the way in which he deals with the country. So, it isn't that much of a leap, as the defector told me, to believe that, they went from abducting people to abducting sperm, really. That there were eggs that were being abducted, that this was. So the breeding idea is like so many things with North Korea, crazy when you first encounter it. And then as you sort of begin to understand it, it seems a little less crazy.
So let's step this forward here. So people have been abducted from beaches, and there's a certain suspicion among some Japanese journalists and academics and politicians, and occasionally it's mentioned and it's often hushed down and people don't talk about it. But then the moment that breaks the dam here is 1987, and this airliner, Korea airliner, so this is just before the Olympic Games, and two North Korean spies blow up the airliner in midair, killing all people on board. And one of the captees, the only captee, because the other one commits suicide, turns out to be a Korean spy trained in Japanese by a Japanese abductee.
Correct. Up until 1987, the abductions were kind of an urban myth, right? They were something that there were a few people who were utterly convinced about and were sort of written off as fanatics. And a few other people sort of had suspicions about, but there was no hard evidence. In 1987, 1988, the South Koreans are supposed to host the Olympic Games, which, as was the case for, say, Tokyo in the 60s, this is the classic sort of coming out party for any kind of country, and was really sort of a show that South Korea was becoming a democracy and real acceptance. And this drove the North Koreans bananas. And they made lots of efforts to try to undermine or even pair up with the North, very much like the last Olympics, actually. And so they'd set out to disrupt the Olympics any way they could. And one of the ways they did was by setting up this airline disaster. And this couple, an older North Korean man and a younger North Korean woman, posed as father and daughter, as Japanese father and daughter, and took a multiple city trip throughout Europe to sort of make sure that no one would be suspicious, and got on this airplane which was returning from the Middle East to Seoul, and full of South Korean workers who had been on various projects there, and left a plastic explosive in the overhead bin, got off the plane, switch to another plane, and then the plane continues on with the luggage and explodes in midair, killing everyone on it. I think it was 141 people in general. And the authorities leaped to, and capture the Japanese couple in one of the airport terminals as they're about to get on another airplane. The older man bites into a cigarette, which is laced with cyanide. I mean, again, stuff out of spy thrillers, and dies instantly. And the woman, the girl, I guess his daughter, claiming to be his daughter, also starts to bite into her cigarette, but a very quick-witted policewoman knocks it out of her hands, and she gets terrible burns on her mouth and in her throat, but does not die. And under questioning, many days, actually weeks of questioning, she finally admits that she is, yes, a North Korean spy, that this was a mission that was given to her directly from Kim Jong-il himself, and that she had been trained to speak and act Japanese by a young Japanese woman who had been abducted. And this was really the first solid link between the this rumored abduction program and reality. 1987 was the first time that there was incontrovertible proof that the abductions had been taking place, or at least one abduction taking place. And it was still not something that was, I think, generally believed. I mean, the South Korean government was well known to be creating propaganda that made the North look bad. And so there was a lot of suspicion that perhaps her confession had been manufactured or guided somehow. So yeah, as much as this was, on the one hand, clear proof that the abductions are going on, there were still people who had many doubts about the legitimacy of this information.
And this builds and builds and builds, and eventually comes to this head. And I suppose this is where you first came to the story, with this remarkable scene in 2002. First of Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi going to Pyongyang for a summit, for then Kim Jong-il at the summit to admit to having the abductees, and then for a month later, them, for at least 5 of them, to be returning to Japan for a air quotes here, visit to their old home.
Yeah, this was where the world really first knew, even within Japan, that the abductions had actually taken place. So after extensive negotiations, Kim and Koizumi meet in Pyongyang. They have these discussions and sign the Pyongyang Declaration, which is essentially a document that would set out the steps that would lead to mutual recognition, because they still don't recognize each other as states. And as part of that, 5 of the Japanese abductees returned home a month later for a visit for supposed to be a few weeks. And then them stepping off of the airplane was really the first evidence and that the world had that this had actually taken place. And that was, I woke up on that morning and looked at the New York Times and saw this picture and just started reading this thing and just thought, this is just the most amazing story. What do these people know? Who are these people? What is your life like after you've spent 24 or 25 years in the North? Can you ever come back? Can you ever assimilate? Or have you been brainwashed? If not, how did you endure? What were your children's lives like? I mean, just the questions just reeled, and that's really what got me hooked on this story, because it just, again, it seemed to be one of those moments where so much of history sort of came to a point, right? Japanese-North Korean relations, this particular event, the contemporary state of North Korea, all these things seemed that if you could dig into this moment and really try to understand what had led to it, you might learn something very revealing about the situation in Northeast Asia in general.
So Kim Jong-il admits to having 13 abductees. He claims that 8 are dead, and of course we'll come to that in just a second because it's going to be important for the modern place that Japan sees this issue in. But he allows them to return to Japan as part of this deal, and of course he keeps their children back in North Korea, I suppose, as a form of hostage taking. But the Japanese abductees, they don't go back to North Korea.
Yes, the plan, the agreement is that the abductees will return to Japan for a period, visit with their families. Originally, the North Koreans had wanted the families to come to visit them in Pyongyang. That the Japanese didn't agree to that. The government said, no, they have to come home first. Then they were supposed to, and this was agreed to by the Japanese, then after a certain number of weeks, the Japanese would go back home, and then they would decide whether they wanted to stay or whether they wanted to come back to Japan with their children. And, because I think in the North Koreans' eyes, there was still some question, right? And whether these people were Japanese or whether they were North Koreans. I mean, they were North Korean citizens officially. I mean, they were, because of the nature of Japanese citizenship, they were also Japanese citizens. They were born in Japan. The children were not. But there was a real question mark about whether they would stay there or go. One thing led to another, and the Japanese, the public reaction was so extraordinarily negative towards the government, and especially once they found out that the government had arranged for the Japanese abductees to return to North Korea, to return to their abductors. The Japanese public and much of the government was just outraged. And the Japanese abductees finally decided that they would stay in Japan, which was a much bigger and more dramatic decision than I think many people realize, because their children were all in North Korea. And, these are people who had been assimilated enough and understood the regime well enough. They knew that the North Korea was perfectly capable of keeping their children forever, that this was not beyond the pale. And that, now you look back and say, well, of course they knew they'd get their children back, but they didn't know that at all. And, you don't have to be a parent to think that life without your children ever again would be just too unbearable. So actually, a number of the abductees, in particular Hasuike Karu's wife and Miss Soga, the wife of Charles Jenkins, they wanted very badly to go back because they were convinced they'd never see their children otherwise. And even Hasuike Karu himself, told me that he had to think very hard, not about the attractiveness of the Japanese society versus North Korean society, and there was no question which side he was on, but would he have a life? Someone in sort of societies like South Korea and Japan, where you are sort of in lockstep with the members of your class in college, and then if you join a corporation, you're in lockstep with them. You don't take a year off. You don't step aside and do something else. There's a lot of social pressure to continue. He had stepped out for 25 years. I mean, what kind of a life would there really be for someone like him in Japan? And he told me very honestly, he said if he had decided and come to the conclusion that he wasn't going to be able to make it on his own here, he would have gone back, and especially to be with his children. So the whole thing sort of exploded, and they stayed there. And then Koizumi eventually, about a year and a half, 14 months later, was able to convince the North Koreans with, again, another very large bribe to release the children and let them come back home. But those 14 months were harrowing, to say the least, for the Japanese abductees who were in Japan being feted, all the while knowing that the North Koreans were watching them and listening to every word they were saying, every interview they gave. And the Japanese public, and the Japanese right wing in particular, was calling on them to denounce the North Korean regime, the very regime which was holding their children. So they had this impossible task of trying to, appear in public occasionally, say things that would not be overly critical of the regime, while also not sounding like they had been brainwashed by the regime. And it was it was, I think, emotionally draining, and I think it really affected their whole perception of Japan and Japanese culture.
So Japan get back their, or at least the abductees that North Korea admits to. North Korea offers, I suppose it's a sort of shallow form of contrition. It's not an open apology, but it's kind of a regret for what happened. And there's a political calculation on both sides here that this will put an end to the issue. This will put them behind them. It'll all be at rest, and we can all move forward. And this was a terrible miscalculation, especially on the Japanese side, because we're going to move into the Japanese question here. And this isn't the end of it for the Japanese. This is just the beginning.
Yeah, it was a terrible blunder. I mean, we have to understand is that the meeting that Koizumi and Kim had, the entire purpose of the Pyongyang Declaration and these negotiations that were undertaken by an extraordinary diplomat named Tanaka Hitoshi, that all of these things were done in the name of getting a treaty and normalization between the countries. That was the goal. That was the purpose of it. The abductees and the whole situation that they represented was a stumbling block, a very important stumbling block, but a stumbling block. And I think of it, actually, I compare it a little bit to the way that the United States and the West in general sort of hell-bent on denuclearization, and the way that human rights issues in North Korea get sort of thrown under the bus oftentimes, and then rear their head occasionally. But, that was the abductees was very secondary. It was as Kant says, it was a necessary but not a sufficient condition. You had to solve the abduction issue with them, but that was not the purpose of the meeting. And the negotiators were very clear about that. But of course, the kind of emotional valence of the abductions in Japan was so extraordinary that it blew up entirely in their face. And the people who were, one might think, would be celebrated for having engineered this breakthrough and gotten abductees back and gotten this history sort of resolved, were vilified.
And you mentioned a couple of times, and I've heard you try to walk away from it a little bit, and I know why you have, just because it can be a sort of overblown statement occasionally, but I think it is actually quite true here. You say that this, in some sense, is Japan's 9/11, and September 11, and the point I suppose you're trying to make there, I think, is that it wasn't so much the tragedy itself, but the psychological damage that it did to the nation. Suddenly, a nation that was so comfortable and safe and inward-looking and thinking the world was quite a nice, friendly place, was suddenly torn open and said, even the weakest people out there can come and attack you, and you're helpless in their case.
Exactly, and this was a phrase, I'm sensitive to this, and because I was in New York on 9/11, and I watched the trade towers fall, and it really has probably in some ways terribly had been the sort of defining event of my lifetime in many ways. And so when I heard this, and not just once or twice, but several times, this was our 9/11, the Japanese are such polite, tasteful people, but it seemed like a tasteless thing to say, and I was a little bit taken aback by it. But again, like these other points, I sort of understood eventually what they meant, which was precisely what you said about how vulnerable even these sort of great nations are to these much less powerful, wealthy nations wreaking havoc and turning their lives upside down. And so I think it was the proverbial wake up call. And it was certainly used that way and continues to be by the conservative elements in Japan, whether they are people who want to, get rid of Article 9 and remilitarize, or whether they're simply people who are sort of sick of Japan apologizing all the time and being stuck with these kinds of attacks from the Chinese and from the Koreans. So it was clearly this sort of moment in which Japanese, even ordinary Japanese, stood up and thought, wait a second, what's been going on? And part of it, too, was that Japan is a very paternalistic country. Life in Japan is very good. The government is omnipresent. The kind of control, I always say Japan is the most socialistic capitalist country I've ever known. And it's, you make a lot of your individual needs and wants secondary to the greater good in every sense. And I think that the Japanese people, a lot of them, realized that the government hadn't been entirely straight with them about the threat from North Korea, about the threat in the abductions in themselves. There was some evidence that people high up in the government, certainly by 1987, and maybe even before that, had known about these abductions and had played them down. So I think there was this real moment of kind of just wondering about the relationship that ordinary Japanese people had to their state.
Let's touch on that question that you mentioned just before about the pacifist constitution, because this came up a lot after the abduction issue. So the abductions themselves weren't enough, of course, for America to trigger its security pact with Japan and come in and help them. And Japan were in this situation of realizing they didn't have diplomatic relations with North Korea. Well, after that situation, they were just building them up. And even if they wanted to act unilaterally and go into North Korea and try to enforce some sort of surrender, they couldn't. They had their hands tied in a sense. And there's this feeling inside Japan that through pacifism and through this necessary apology and being cowed for the Second World War, that they'd opened themselves up and made themselves easy victims, easy prey.
Yes, and it was this, again, really called into question the whole post-war arrangement with the United States, that they would be the guarantors, the United States would be the guarantors of Japan's security, that Japan could build up a so-called self-defense force, but would be very careful about not using it in any offensive manner. It really it made them think about what good is this? And I think, again, this is a theme that you see much more starkly today, where the Japanese and others wonder, what would it take for America to step in? Whose interest is the United States really thinking about? And I think this really sort of started that kind of thinking and tapped very nicely into the kind of anti-American, anti-militarist protests that were taking place in the 60s, even right after 1952, when the Americans stopped occupying Japan. But that whole sort of school of thought that was very suspicious of American aims, I think this was a perfect example of that.
And I think a great example of just how emotional the politics had become at this time is how strong and how powerful the abductee pressure group was. And you mentioned in your book that, in a sense, they were making policy, and if government passed a policy without consulting them and they turned on them, by that afternoon the policy would change back around again. They effectively were running the government's foreign policy towards at least North Korea.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary moment, and people who study Japanese government understand the depth of this, how extraordinary it was, better than I do. But again, this is a very enormous state, incredible bureaucracy, very paternalistic. Citizens vote, but in terms of the role that the ordinary citizen has in government is fairly negligible. And yet you had these abduction groups, whether it was Mr. and Mrs. Yokota, the parents of Megumi Yokota, or other members of the families of those who have been abducted, who, when they finally started recognizing that they had common cause and they started getting together. And this is almost all that takes place post 87, even post 97. And, there were sort of looked as these kind of groups of sort of fringe types. They had some sort of conspiracy, my children, they didn't just disappear, they were abducted by North Korea. A lot of people would sort of roll their eyes, or whatever the Japanese equivalent of rolling your eyes is. And so you had these diehards, and a few of them, these fascinating former communists who had become very right-wing, who are great characters, and they're absolutely convinced that this is exactly how the North Korean government operates. They've got all this evidence. The government's been saying, no, these aren't happening, and then in this moment where you have 5 people get off a plane and all the conspiracy theories that these people have been spouting become verified and are true, and everything the government's been saying is shown to be false in that one instant. It was this amazing moment where the kind of moral clarity and absolute belief of these groups, these abduction groups, became so important that they had this, if not creating policy, certainly vetoing any policy they disagreed with. And the government, to this day, kowtows to these groups. It is notable. Every president since Clinton, actually not Clinton, it's Bush, has individually met with these abduction groups. Every American ambassador has met with these groups. They were able to get Donald Trump in the United Nations to invoke Megumi Yokota's name and the abductions. He most recently met with them when he was in Japan. They have, that's with the United States government, much less the Japanese government, where every politician there, certainly in the ruling party, has to pay their respects to, and they get extraordinary access to the prime minister's office. This is, I can't think of a policy or a pressure group in the United States or almost anywhere else that has this kind of effect, and that all comes out of the moral certainty and the moral correctness and the empirical correctness of that one moment.
And I suppose now we have to talk about the Chosun Soren. The Chosun Soren is this community of, ethnic Koreans living in Japan that have not just a strong affinity for North Korea, but actually finance them, at least try to finance them. They certainly did in the past, and they try to today. And they really are supporters of the North Korean government. And during those early years when some reporters and some documentary makers were talking about the abduction issue, they were effectively harassed, at least in part, by some of the Chosen Soren who phoned up their workplaces and told them that they should stop their employees from making these movies or talking about this issue. And it's a strange kind of place that this society sits inside North Korea. Inside Japan, because they really are an enclave unto themselves.
Yes, in the aftermath of the Second World War, there were a tremendous number, upwards of 1 million ethnic Koreans in Japan. Some of them had been brought to Japan as part of the war effort, but there had been Koreans in Japan for generations before that. There were many generations of ethnic Koreans who had been born in Japan by that time anyway. So at the end of the war, with the whole idea of sort of returning peoples to their countries, there was this big question mark over the Koreans. Whose country is the Korean supposed to be in? Certainly if you've lived in Japan since the early 20th century, and when you have a war brewing on the Korean Peninsula and all sorts of militarist actions and massacres going on both in the north and the south, do you really send someone back to this situation? And there was actually incredible, although there was an outflow, there was also an incredible inflow of Koreans to Japan immediately after the war. So the ethnic Korean minority or ethnic minority in Japan has always been one of the largest, now only recently surpassed by the Chinese as the largest ethnic minority in Japan. And they, after the war, the ones who were staying in Japan divided themselves into two groups. One was the Mindan, and the other was the Chosen Soren. Chongrong is the Korean term. And the Mindan were those who sympathized with the South Koreans, and the Chosen Soren was those who sympathized with the North Korean state. And the numbers were far greater in the Chosen Soren. The Mindan was much smaller than Chosen Soren initially. And Chosen Soren had this sort of de facto state representative status since there were diplomatic relations between North Korea and Japan. I mean, you got to remember, there weren't diplomatic relations between South Korea and Japan until 1965. So the Chosen Soren played this very important role in catering to its members in Japan and had very strong ties to North Korea at this time because the North Korean economy was doing so well in the 60s and 70s. They funded Chosen Soren. It was later when the North Korean economy is ailing that Chosen Soren starts funding the North. And it was clearly also a place where all sorts of intelligence and infiltration and spying was going on among Chosen Soren members of spying on Japan. That's very clear. And it also is pretty clear that the Chosen Soren members, some of them helped with the abductions. And by helped, I mean, you can't simply pull up on a beach out of nowhere and start abducting people. You have to have people who have scouted out locations and done some forward intelligence work. And it's pretty clear that Chosen Soren members did that as well.
And there's this element as well here on this issue of Japan and Korea together of the Empire Strikes Back, I suppose. So when Japan was first talking through the idea of having a summit and they started talking about the issue of abductions, the North Koreans didn't want to hear it, but they would always still reply with this quote I have from your book, that after all, you Japanese kidnapped 100,000 of us during colonization. And of course, this speaks to some of those unanswered questions today, such as the comfort women issue and all these sort of claims of islands and principles in the sea. So this is a feeling, at least a troubling moment for the Japanese of how are they meant to look at this former colony that they did so much harm to, now coming back and doing, I suppose, a very small slither of that harm back to them.
Yes, there was this, the question of moral equivalence is fascinating. And we think about that, one of the things that made sort of the Cold War work and the Cold War movies work was this question of moral equivalence. Is it really good versus evil or just two different systems? And the to this day, I mean, defenders or either defenders of the North or just anti-Japanese will tell me, well, they abducted us, kind of thing, like this is payback sort of thing. And I point out that's just sort of schoolyard logic, and there's no morality to that. But that was very much the perception. You are the oppressor, Japan. We are the victims. Don't come talk to us about that. What you should be coming to talk to us about is reparations, which you gave to South Korea in 1965, about $10 billion worth of reparations. We want ours, which was sort of the leitmotif of all these negotiations. I mean, clearly, what was in it for the North Koreans in 2002 was a very large economic package. Diplomatic relations were all very well and nice. The abductees, yes, we should probably resolve this kind of thing, but it was all about the money, as it often is with the North Koreans. And so they were very crafty about their negotiations. And again, as I think the United States will learn at its peril, the North Koreans are very good negotiators. I always think about North Korea as a country that's had the worst hand in a poker game for 60 years and always manages to play to a draw. And they don't have to win. They just have to play to a draw, and they do it every time with the worst cards. So these are brilliant negotiators who have thought through the negotiations far in advance. And when in the mid to late 90s, when Japanese diplomats in various meetings, exploratory meetings, would start bringing up, listen, we should probably deal with this question of these abducted Japanese, the North Korean diplomats in the room, clearly under instructions, would stand up and leave the room, walk out. How outrageous. You bring up this sort of thing, you who abducted all of these hundreds of thousands of Koreans. And after this happened a few times, the Japanese diplomats realized that they needed a different phrase. So they said, we'd like to bring up the question of the missing Japanese. And that was okay. The North Koreans said, oh, missing Japanese. Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll look into that. And you'll notice also periodically the abduction issue will be paired up with the question of Japanese soldiers lost in Korea during the Second World War. And so this is, I think, a sort of a protective coloration, as they call it, a way that you can, under the rubric of missing peoples, you can sort of deal with the abductions, not as this horrific act of state terrorism, but as a sort of add-on to this other thing of, well, we have to, help return bodies, cadavers. And this is, again, I mean, you see this sort of past as prologue. This is exactly what's going on with the United States. If you notice that one of the parts of the agreement, the limited agreement that Trump and Kim came to, was that they would help digging up those missing in action from the Korean War, which had been an ongoing process for actually many years before. So when they were finally able to bring up the right sort of use the right terms that avoided the whole question of abduction or kidnapping, then the North Koreans would have a conversation. And I think that was very much indication of the way that they wanted to talk about these issues, that this was not an issue of state power or volition. It was a question of helping to clean up after the horrors of a war which had been begun and inflicted upon the Koreans by the Japanese.
And this walks us forward, I suppose, to the present-day circumstance, where the abduction issue sits right now. So there was 13 that North Korea admitted to. They let 5 go. They claimed 8 were dead in extremely rare and outlandish circumstances, but dead nonetheless. And but there's a moment that you mentioned in the book a couple of times that when you go to Japan, you go to this radio station, and from that radio station, they keep beaming in messages to North Korea. And these are families that when someone has gone missing, they had this, I'm not sure if hope is the right word, but they had this feeling that maybe it was the North Koreans that took them. So this issue feels like it's still very much alive, if not just for those 8 people that are maybe still there or maybe dead. But it's a much broader issue, and many, many more people inside Japan believe that they have relatives over in North Korea still.
It's still a live issue. I mean, it's only within the last year or two that in official polling in Japan, that the nuclear issue has superseded the abduction issue in popular imagination. It's not front page news as much as it is, but it's lurking there. It's one of those things that can easily be resurrected as a contemporary concern. And there's a very specific reason for that. And one is the general reason of just people still wondering, well, maybe if these people were abducted, maybe someone else is abducted too. Everyone said it hadn't happened then, and it turned out to have happened. So maybe it's happened to my son, daughter, nephew, niece. But when the Japanese were negotiating with the North Koreans about how many abductees and who they were, by this time they both had lists of some sort. And the Japanese list had a certain number of names on it, and the North Korean list had a certain number of names on it. One name that did not appear on the North Korean list was Hitomi Soga, a woman who had been abducted with her mother from Sado Island.
I think you meant not on the Japanese list there, sorry.
I'm sorry, yes. Japanese, yes. Not on the Japanese list is Hitomi Soga. And so she appears as if out of nowhere. Now, we knew about the Chimuras, we knew about the Hasuikes, we knew about Megumi and these other people, but she's out of nowhere.
Is that just because her family doesn't believe that's happened to her, or is there some other reason for that, do you know?
Her mother disappears with her, but does not show up in North Korea, and it's not clear what happened to her. The father, by all accounts, sort of a ne'er-do-well who doesn't make a stink about this, and so they sort of just disappeared, and I'm not clear exactly why, but the fact of her showing up unbidden, unasked for, unrequested, had a really big emotional pull, and the man Araki Kazuhiro, who is the man who now runs this Radio Shiokaze that you were describing before, was at the time working with one of the abduction groups, and he starts getting these telephone calls, immediately afterwards. My daughter disappeared in the late 70s in these circumstances. Do you think maybe she could be? And he starts realizing that the people who need his help are the vast number of people who have lost somebody, and maybe they have been lost through the abductions. Stranger things have happened, and this whole other list, this whole other movement, is really launched by the absence of the name of one woman on one list.
So, as a final question here, we spoke a lot about how the abduction issue has sort of, in a way, galvanized Japanese society to a more militarized stance, but it has twisted a little bit recently. So you mentioned a lot about a particular person, Sado, who was an advocate for the abductees movements, and of course he's had an attempt on his life, and he gets death threats every single day. And there's this movement inside Japan today that maybe this aggressive stance that we once talk about, pressure in North Korea, is perhaps not the way to do this, and we should be having a more softly approach. And this also goes towards an article that popped up, I suppose, yesterday, that ex-foreign minister Tanaka wrote about criticizing the Abe government's approach, that perhaps there has to be another way to get this. And I suppose to tie into that, is there a resolution possible, do you think?
Well, Tanaka Hitoshi is this extraordinary Japanese statesman, diplomat, and he was Koizumi's right-hand man in these negotiations. He sort of single-handedly took over and reached out and conducted these secret negotiations, mostly in Dailan and other parts of China, with the North Koreans. And it's an incredible story in and of itself. He's a very well-educated guy, his degrees from Oxford, perfect English, really extraordinary man. And he, after the abductions were resolved, in the sense of the 5 coming home, was turned on and accused of being a traitor for giving in to the North Koreans. There was actually a bomb placed in front of his house, and he's never had a government position since then. And this is, the probably the most august statesman in Japanese public life. He had always been very critical of Abe and the way that Abe used this issue, the kind of the political hay Abe had made out of this, and the kind of the drama that he had milked from this issue. And he gave a speech at the Japan Foreign Press Center last week in which he said that this kind of diplomacy where everything's based on, spectacular summits, right? We'll meet face to face, or Donald Trump-esque style, and that will resolve everything. That's actually not the way to get anything done. Certainly not something like this, that you need careful, detailed, unglamorous, dogged diplomacy to try to resolve issues as complicated as this. And I thought that was an important and a really salient point, corrective to what's going on, not just in Japan, but in the world. Because to this day, most of the time when the Japanese bring up the abduction issue to the North Koreans, one level or another of official will respond with the stock phrase that it has been resolved, that there is nothing more to talk about. There are no more abductees. We resolved this thing. We signed the Pyongyang Declaration, as did you. We all agreed to stop talking about it, which is true. Let's move on. And that is not going to be resolved by Kim and Abe meeting in some place and shaking hands and saying things to each other.
Do you think that maybe? Sorry, just to butt in a little bit there. Do you think that maybe there's this feeling around that Japan, if America and North Korea ever manage to produce a denuclearization deal, there's this feeling out there that Japan will hold out, that unless in some way they include a resolution to the abduction issue in the nuclear issue, that Japan simply won't sign it. It's a deathbed for any Japanese government that dares to do that.
Well, unfortunately, there's nothing for the Japanese to refuse to sign. They've already been sidelined completely in this, despite the incredible efforts of the Abe administration and the sort of the creation of a relationship between him and Trump and stuff. The human rights stuff is just going to get trampled, as often happens, if there is any kind of resolution with the nuclear deal. But I think the Japanese are in fairly desperate straits right now, because there's really their voices and their concerns have been completely left out, precisely because there hasn't been the sort of diplomacy that you'd have, where you'd have the State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and all the various levels and people who talk to each other coordinating activities. None of that's taking place. Now you just have, one guy show up and shake hands and smile for the cameras and say God knows what behind closed doors. So there's really no way to coordinate those things. So I think that Tanaka's comment was aimed as much at Abe as it was at Trump, probably, to say, Jesus, diplomats actually the way that diplomacy and diplomats is the way that things actually get done in the real world, and stop this fantasy that the great men are going to get together and just solve things through a handshake, because that's just not going to happen.
So on that note, we might end it there. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed it. So the book we've been speaking about today is The Invitation Only Zone, the true story of North Korea's abduction project. Yeah, so Robert Boynton, I'm going to attach a biographical link below this podcast so listeners can go and find your other works, of course. But it's been an enjoyable experience. I've loved it. So Robert Boynton, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation.